Greetings! In this video, I will tell you about the tank battle of Dubno-Lutsk-Brody, which took place at the very beginning of the German-Soviet War in June 1941. This was the largest tank battle in history, involving the greatest number of tanks. Let me immediately highlight the main intrigue of this story. How did it happen that the Soviet tank force, which had 4 times more tanks than the Germans, was completely defeated, losing the overwhelming majority of its tanks irreversibly? A brief overview of the battle. On the very first day of the war, the 1st German tank group under the command of General Ewald von Kleist broke through and advanced deep into the rear of the Red Army. The Soviet Mechanized Corps were ordered to defeat the Germans and destroy the breakthrough tank group. From June 25th to June 29th, intense tank battles took place within the Dubno-Lutsk-Brody triangle. The result, the Soviet forces were completely crushed. Now let's take a closer look. I will begin with an overview of the opposing forces. On the Soviet side, 5 mechanized corps took part in the battle. The 8th, 9th, 15th, 19th, and 22nd, later joined by the 8th Tank Division, which was transferred from the 4th Mechanized Corps. These 5 mechanized corps had a total of 2,803 tanks, plus 325 tanks from the 8th Division, making a total of 3,128 tanks. What kind of tanks were they? Most of the light tanks consisted of the T-26, a 1933 model weighing 11 tons, protected by bulletproof armor and armed with a 45mm cannon and 2 to 3 machine guns. The armor of this tank was easily penetrated by the 37mm guns of German tanks, but the T-26's 45mm cannon could pierce the armor of all German tanks. Next, the T-27, a 1931 model, was a light, turretless tankette armed with a machine gun, which could hardly play any significant role in tank combat. The T-37A was a light, amphibious tank weighing just over 3 tons and armed with a machine gun. The T-38 was a slightly modernized version of the previous tank. However, the T-27, T-37A, and T-38 were few in number, and as you can imagine, played no role in the tank battles. In addition to these, the Red Army had tanks from the BT series, which were fast-moving tanks. The BT-5 tank, like the T-26, was protected by bulletproof armor and equipped with a 45mm cannon. This was a wheeled tracked tank capable of reaching speeds of 52 kilometers per hour on tracks and 72 kilometers per hour on wheels. There were also BT-7 tanks, which were slightly modernized versions of the BT-5. The Soviet Corps also included medium and heavy tanks. Among the medium tanks, 2 types stood out. The T-28, a 3-turret tank weighing about 26 tons, was armed with a 76mm cannon and 4 to 5 machine guns, protected by bulletproof armor. It had been produced since 1933 and was already obsolete by the start of the war. A formidable force was the T-34 medium tank. It was equipped with a 76mm cannon, capable of penetrating the armor of all German tanks without exception at any distance limited only by the horizon. A German tank, on the other hand, had to get as close as possible to the T-34 and strike from the side to penetrate its armor with its 37, millimeter gun, as the T-34's frontal armor was impervious to German fire. It was one of the first tanks in the world with shell-resistant armor. There were 310 T-34 tanks in the Soviet grouping, 171 tanks in 5 Corps, plus 139 tanks in the 8th Tank Division. Heavy tanks were represented by two types. The first was the T-35 heavy tank, of which there were 45 units. This was a monstrous 58-ton vehicle, but it had only bulletproof armor. It was armed with a 76-millimeter cannon and two 45-millimeter cannons in 5 turrets. At first glance, this tank might have seemed like a formidable force, but the 5-turret configuration proved extremely ineffective, and after the first battles, production of this tank was discontinued. A much more promising heavy tank was the KV-1. Like the T-34, it was equipped with shell-resistant armor. Its 76-millimeter cannon could also penetrate the armor of all German tanks, and its armor was at least as good as, if not better than, that of the T-34. There were 186 KV-1 heavy tanks in the Soviet grouping, 136 in the corps, and 50 in the reserve, 50 in an attached division. In addition, the Red Army had 33 KV-2 tanks. This tank was armed with a 152-millimeter howitzer designed to fire concrete-piercing shells. However, it was quite difficult to maintain. At the beginning of the war, concrete-piercing howitzers were not needed, as there were no German fortresses to attack. It is possible that the KV-2 was used as a self-propelled artillery unit firing high-explosive or fragmentation shells, but in a tank battle it was useless. Now let's meet the opponent of the Red Army, the German tank force. Kleist's tank group consisted of 4 tank divisions with a total of 585 tanks. During the battle, the 9th Tank Division joined them, adding 143 more tanks, bringing the German total to 728 tanks. This number does not seem impressive, but perhaps the Germans had some kind of super tanks? Well, let's take a look at these monsters. The German grouping included 54 tanks designated by the abbreviation BEF, Befehlswagen Panzer. These were so-called command tanks, equipped with a radio station. They did not even have turrets, were only bulletproof, and were armed with a machine gun. These vehicles were not capable of direct tank combat. There were also 8 Panzer-weighing PZE vehicles. This was a light tank armed with 2 machine guns. I think it's not hard to guess its combat value. The grouping also included 211 Panzer II tanks, light tanks with bulletproof armor armed with a 20-millimeter automatic cannon. Judging by the characteristics of this weapon, shells from this cannon could penetrate the armor of light Soviet tanks. However, as you understand, penetration power alone is not enough. What matters is the shell's effect after penetrating the armor. I highly doubt that a 20-millimeter shell, even after piercing the armor, could destroy the crew or disable the tank unless it hit the ammunition storage. Overall, I am quite skeptical about this tank's capabilities in tank combat. And now, finally, a truly decent combat vehicle, the Panzer III, PS3, of which there were 355 in the German grouping. This was a tank weighing up to 20 tons, classified as a medium tank. Its armor was stronger than that of Soviet tanks, but it was still only bulletproof and offered no real protection against shells. The 37-millimeter cannon, with which most of these tanks were equipped, could penetrate the armor of light Soviet tanks. Some Panzer III tanks were fitted with more powerful 50-millimeter cannons, but even these could not penetrate the frontal armor of the T-34 from a distance greater than 100 meters. However, I don't see anything particularly special about this tank. Sure, the crew had more comfort compared to Soviet tanks, and the guns were more accurate and had a higher rate of fire. But Soviet light tanks, let alone medium and heavy ones, could destroy them quite successfully. Finally, the German grouping included 100 Panzer IV tanks. This vehicle weighed slightly over 20 tons, and while its armor had been reinforced, it was still not fully shell-resistant. However, it did have a very powerful 75-millimeter gun. The problem was that this gun was extremely short, only 24 calibers in length, and was primarily intended for firing at infantry and unarmored targets, not for penetrating armor. Consider this. For a shell to have armor-piercing capability, it must be accelerated to high speed, which is only possible if the gun barrel is long enough. The first Panzer III models with 43 to 48 caliber barrels, which were actually capable of engaging in tank battles, were only introduced at the end of 1941. So, the existing Panzer IV was also unsuitable for tank combat. Additionally, it should be noted that the backbone of German anti-tank artillery consisted of 37-millimeter POC 36 guns, which were incapable of dealing with Soviet medium and heavy tanks. German soldiers who had experience in these battles bitterly referred to their guns as Christmas crackers or door knockers, meaning they could knock on the tank's armor, but they couldn't penetrate it. And now, tell me, what should have been the outcome of this confrontation? It seems to me that any sane person, when asked who would win this battle, could only give one answer. The Soviet army should have utterly crushed the German grouping, leaving nothing but memories. But reality was entirely different. The Red Army's grouping was shattered. According to researchers, Soviet losses in the tank battle amounted to 2,648 tanks. German losses, on the other hand, reached 285 tanks. Moreover, it should be noted that only 85 tanks were permanently lost, while 200 damaged tanks were repaired and returned to battle. The Red Army also suffered enormous losses in artillery and manpower. So what caused such an illogical outcome? Researchers point to a whole set of reasons. The first is the inexperience of Soviet tank crews. German tankers had already been fighting for 2 years, while the Soviet ones had not yet smelled gunpowder. Allow me to challenge this claim. A significant portion of Soviet tankers had participated in battles at Khalkhin Gol, May-September 1939, and in the Soviet-Finnish War, which began in November 1939 and ended in March 1940. Thousands of Soviet tanks were involved in these conflicts, and many of the tankers of the Southwestern Front were veterans of these wars, and among the Germans, not everyone was an ace either, since some of their tank divisions had only recently been formed. Some argue that the Germans managed to invent a kind of magic wand against Soviet medium and heavy tanks, the 88-millimeter Flock 1836-37 anti-aircraft gun. Allegedly, this gun took out Soviet T-34s and KV-1s in droves, as if on a firing range. This claim is simply untenable. Yes, shells from these guns could easily penetrate the armor of the best Soviet tanks from long range. But take a look at a photo of this gun. It's a towering structure, as visible on the battlefield as a tank. Nothing like a stealthy anti-tank gun. It wouldn't take much intelligence to take out this massive target. Moreover, keep in mind that to destroy a tank, you had to hit it directly. But to disable this gun, it was enough for a 76-millimeter high explosive shell from a T-34 or even a 45 millimeter shell from a T-26 to explode within a few meters. That would wound or kill some of the crew or damage the gun's optics. Additionally, there were very few of these guns. By the end of 1941, the entire German ground forces had received only 126 of them. So, how many could there have been in the battle in question? The next commonly cited reason is that Soviet tanks were unreliable and frequently broke down. Well, that's true. Soviet tanks did break down often, especially the notoriously finicky KV-2. However, even in 1943 and 1944, the situation with tank reliability did not improve significantly, yet such catastrophic consequences did not occur. And finally, the last and quite serious argument, the defeat of Soviet tank units was due to extremely poor logistical support. There was a constant shortage of ammunition and fuel. There's no arguing with that. It's a fact. But military logistics had always been a weak spot for the Soviet and later Russian army. Supply issues persisted throughout the war, yet after the second half of 1942, they never led to disasters on this scale. I find the argument of those researchers most convincing who see the primary cause of the Red Army's defeats in the summer of 1941 as the soldiers' unwillingness to sacrifice their lives to defend Stalin's regime. Think about it. Most Red Army soldiers were the children of peasants who had witnessed the nightmare of collectivization from an early age. Many had also endured the Holodomor. It is no coincidence that by the end of 1941, the Red Army had lost nearly 3 million men as prisoners of war. The majority surrendered simply because they did not want to risk their lives defending the Soviet regime and saw captivity as a better chance to survive. To this, one must add the soldiers' complete distrust of their commanders. Red Army soldiers saw that a significant number of their officers were incompetent, made irrational decisions, and sought any excuse to flee the front and retreat to the rear. They had every reason to believe that such commanders would easily sacrifice them and waste their lives for nothing. As a result, any minor tank malfunction or temporary fuel shortage was not seen as an unfortunate setback that needed to be fixed by repairing the tank or finding a way to refuel and continue fighting, but as a lucky break, an opportunity to withdraw from battle, retreat to the rear, and save their own lives. And make no mistake, a significant number of these tank malfunctions were either imaginary or ones that the crew could have repaired on their own. That is why the Germans did not have to go through great effort to destroy many Soviet tanks. The crews abandoned them themselves. The Germans, after minor repairs and modifications, gladly used these captured tanks. With that, I conclude my account. Goodbye